Peace be upon you, dear viewers. Today's video takes us on a deeply emotional journey through the hardships of Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him, a journey that not only defined a man, but shaped the destiny of a global faith, Islam. Stay with us until the end, because these stories will not only increase your love for the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, but also strengthen your patience and trust in Allah during your own trials. From the very beginning, the life of Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, was filled with challenges, trials, and tests, each one shaping him into the perfect role model for mankind. He was born in the year 570 CE, a time historically known as the Year of the Elephant, in the holy city of Makkah. While Makkah was revered for housing the Kaaba, it had sadly become a city steeped in ignorance and darkness, a place where idol worship was rampant. Hundreds of idols were placed inside and around the Kaaba, and the pure monotheism of Prophet Ibrahim A.S. had been largely forgotten, but the corruption was not just spiritual, it was also social, political, and moral. Makkah was plagued by tribal warfare, where loyalty to one's clan came before justice or truth. The weak were oppressed, women had little to no rights, the poor were exploited, and newborn girls were buried alive. The strong preyed on the weak, and there was no protection for the vulnerable. In the midst of this moral and spiritual decay, Allah chose Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, to be born, not into power or wealth, but into difficulty and hardship. This environment, full of injustice and immorality, would be the backdrop against which he would rise, cleanse hearts, and guide people to the light of Islam. From the moment of his birth, his life was never about ease. It was about endurance, purpose, and transformation. Even before he could take his first steps or utter his first words, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, faced his first great loss, the loss of his father, Abdullah. His father passed away while his mother Amina was still pregnant with him, during a journey to Yathrib, later known as Medina. Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, entered this world as an orphan, never knowing the warmth of a father's embrace, never hearing his voice or feeling his protection. He never saw his father smile, nor was he held in his arms. This early absence left a void that would echo through his childhood, shaping him with a deep sense of independence and reliance solely on Allah. It was a silent, profound beginning to a life that would be marked by both sorrow and spiritual greatness. Then, at the tender age of 6, another heartbreaking moment came into young life of Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him. While returning from a trip to Yathrib, what we now call Medina, his beloved mother, Amina, suddenly fell ill and passed away in a place called Abwa, between Makkah and Medina. Imagine a child so small, already without a father, now watch his mother slip away in a distant land, far from home, far from comfort. The young Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, was now completely orphaned, left with no parents to care for him. The sorrow was deep, the loneliness real. But this wasn't abandonment. It was divine preparation. Allah was shaping his final messenger, training him through hardship, so that his heart would carry away the world with unmatched compassion and strength. After losing his mother, the young Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, was taken in by his grandfather, Abu Talib, a respected leader of the Quraysh and caretaker of the Kaaba. Abu Talib cherished his grandson deeply, seeing in him signs of greatness and often keeping him close by. But this period of stability was short-lived. Just 2 years later, when Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, was only 8 years old, his grandfather also passed away. The cycle of loss continued, but so did Allah's protection. He was then entrusted the care of his uncle, Abu Talib, who raised him with deep love and fierce loyalty, despite not being a Muslim. Each transition, though marked with grief and sorrow, also came with compassion and care, allowing the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, to grow in strength, patience, and character. Through every shift, Allah was guiding him, preparing him for the mission to come. As a youth, Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, stood out in a society that was drowning in corruption. While others indulged in alcohol, gambling, idolatry, and immoral behavior, he chose a different path, one of purity, dignity, and self-control. He was never seen lying, cheating, or breaking a promise. In fact, People began calling him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and As-Sadiq, the truthful. Whether he was entrusted with money, secrets, or disputes, he always handled them with integrity. Even though the environment around him was spiritually and morally bankrupt, his heart remained clean. He was protected by Allah from falling into the sins that surrounded him. His character wasn't shaped by the culture. He rose above it. This purity in youth became the foundation for the message he would one day carry to all of mankind. At the age of 25, Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, entered into a beautiful and blessed marriage with Khadijah bint Khuwaylid. May Allah please with her, a noble, wise, and wealthy businesswoman of Makkah. She had witnessed his honesty and integrity during their business dealings and was deeply impressed by his character. Their marriage was filled with mutual love, respect, and trust. Khadijah, may Allah be pleased with her, became his greatest supporter, his comfort during hardship, and his closest confidant. She stood by him through every challenge, providing not just emotional support, but unwavering faith in his mission. Their home was a sanctuary of peace amidst the chaos of the world around them. But this peaceful chapter, though cherished, would not last long. A storm was coming, the divine calling that would soon turn his world upside down and test him in ways no man had ever been tested before. At the age of 40, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, experienced a moment that would change the course of human history. While meditating in the quiet solitude of the cave of Hira, away from the noise and corruption of Makkah, the angel Gabriel, appeared to him with the first divine revelation. Read in the name of your Lord who created. It was a moment of profound spiritual awakening, the beginning of prophethood. But what should have been a time of honor and celebration quickly became the start of unimaginable hardship. The weight of revelation, the fear of rejection, and the responsibility of carrying Allah's final message to mankind, these began to unfold rapidly. Life as he knew it was over. His mission had begun, and the trials were just getting started. The Quraysh tribe, who once held Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, in the highest regard, calling him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, suddenly turned against him. The same people who once trusted him with their wealth and secrets now saw him as a threat to their idols, their traditions, and their control. His own uncles, cousins, friends, and neighbors, people he had lived among his entire life, began to mock him, humiliate him, and accuse him of madness and sorcery. They laughed at his message and called him a liar, even though they had never known him to lie. The betrayal was not just public, it was deeply personal. The pain of being rejected by his own people, those who knew him best, was heavy, and yet he bore it with dignity, never retaliating in anger, only calling them to the truth with patience and compassion. They hurled the most cruel accusations at the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. They called him a madman, a sorcerer, a liar, and a poet who was making things up. These slanders weren't just random insults. They were designed to undermine his message and destroy his reputation. And yet, these were the very people who once praised his honesty, who entrusted him with their wealth and personal affairs, knowing he had never told a single lie in his entire life. The injustice of their accusations was painful. Imagine being known as the most trustworthy man in society, only to be ridiculed the moment you speak the truth. Still, the Prophet, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, bore it all with grace and patience. He never raised his voice in anger. He never responded with curses. His heart remained soft, and his eyes remained fixed on Allah. The early Muslims faced brutal persecution, simply for believing in one God. They were tortured in public, beaten, starved, and humiliated by their own families and tribes. Among them was Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, who was tied up and dragged across the scorching sands of Makkah, a heavy stone placed on his chest as he whispered, "Ahad, Ahad, one God, one God." Yasser and Sumaya, may Allah be pleased with them, were among the first martyrs of Islam. Sumaya, an elderly woman, was speared to death in the street for her faith, and the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, could only watch with tears in his eyes, unable to physically stop the torment. He had no army, no protection, only pray in the unshakable faith that Allah was watching and that justice would come. In desperation, the Quraysh leaders tried every tactic to stop the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. When threats and torture failed, they tried bribery. They offered him wealth beyond imagination, leadership over all of Makkah, and even the most beautiful women in marriage. If only he would stop preaching Islam. They pleaded with his uncle Abu Talib to make him compromise, even just a little. But the Prophet, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, remained unshaken. He responded with words that would echo through history. Even if they place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I will never abandon this mission until either Allah makes it victorious or I perish in the process. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was pure devotion to Allah and a commitment to truth that no reward or pressure could break. 3 years after the public call to Islam began, the leaders of Quraysh grew more desperate and cruel. They enforced a severe social and economic boycott against the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, and his followers, including members of his own clan, the Banu Hashim. They were banished to a barren, rocky valley called Abu Talib, with no access to trade, food, or supplies. For 3 long years, they suffered in isolation. The cries of hungry children echoed through the valley. Food became so scarce that people were forced to eat leaves, dry grass, and even chew on leather just to survive. Despite the crushing hunger and hardship, the Prophet, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, remained steadfast. He encouraged his companions, comforted the weak, and never once gave up the mission. His resilience was a testament of unwavering faith in the face of cruelty. After 3 brutal years in the valley of Abu Talib, the boycott was finally lifted. But just as the Muslims began to breathe again, a greater sorrow descended upon the heart of the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. His beloved wife, Khadijah, may Allah be pleased with her, passed away. She was more than just a wife. She was his emotional refuge, his most loyal supporter, and the mother of his children. Her death left a deep void in his heart. And as if that pain wasn't enough, just weeks later, his beloved uncle Abu Talib, who had protected him from the Quraysh for over 40 years, also died. In a matter of days, the Prophet, may peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, lost both his inner strength and outer protection. It was one of the darkest moments of his life, but he continued to place his trust in Allah alone. With both his beloved wife Khadijah, may Allah be pleased with her, and his protective uncle Abu Talib gone, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was left exposed, emotionally and physically. The Quraysh, no longer afraid of tribal consequences, intensified their attacks, knowing he had no one to shield him. He had lost his home comfort and his social defense in the same season. This period became known as the Year of Sorrow. It wasn't just sorrow from loss, but from loneliness, vulnerability, and the weight of a mission that now felt even heavier. Yet, the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, never turned bitter. He continued to call to Islam, even in grief, showing that his strength came not from people, but from his deep connection with Allah. In a state of deep sorrow and desperation, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, set out on foot to the city of Taif, about 60 kilometers from Makkah. His hope was to find open hearts, people who might support his mission and offer him protection. But instead of mercy, he was met with cruelty and mockery. The leaders of Taif not only rejected him, but turned the children and slaves of the city against him. They lined the streets, pelting him with stones and insults as he walked away. His feet bled, soaking his sandals, and his noble face was marked with pain and rejection. He fled to the outskirts of the city, physically wounded, emotionally shattered, and utterly alone, yet never cursing them, never seeking revenge. This moment was one of the deepest heartbreaks of his life. Yet, even after being rejected, humiliated, and wounded, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, did not pray for revenge. He didn't curse the people of Taif or ask for their destruction. Instead, he turned to Allah with a heart full of humility and compassion, and offered prayer that reflects his unshakable faith and limitless mercy. He said, "O Allah, I complain to you of my weakness, my lack of resources, and my humiliation before the people. But if you are not angry with me, then I do not care. Your mercy is more expansive for me." This powerful moment shows that his greatest concern wasn't the pain. It was whether he still had Allah's pleasure. Even in his lowest moment, his love for Allah was higher than any worldly suffering. This level of humility and trust in Allah is truly beyond comprehension for most of us. After facing the worst kind of rejection, physical pain, and emotional heartbreak, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, didn't stop. He didn't retreat into anger or hopelessness. Instead, he continued moving forward, step by step, on the path of truth, fueled not by public support, but by deep certainty in Allah's wisdom. He knew that every hardship had meaning. Every pain had a purpose. He trusted that Allah's plan was greater than what the eye could see. Even when the world turned its back on him, he never turned his back on the mission. He stood as a beacon of light, showing us that faith isn't proven in times of ease, but in how we respond when we're broken, yet still believe. After enduring immense sorrow and rejection, Allah, the most merciful, gifted the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, with one of the most miraculous and comforting experiences of his life, Israa and Mi'raj, the night journey and ascension. In a single night, he was taken by the angel Gabriel, from Mecca to Jerusalem, and from there ascended through the 7 heavens, meeting past prophets, witnessing the unseen, and drawing closer to Allah than any human ever has. And there, in the divine presence, he was gifted something incredible, Salah, prayer, a direct connection between the servant and the Creator. At a time when he felt alone on earth, Allah invited him to the heavens, as if to say, "You are never truly alone." This journey was both a spiritual elevation and a deep personal healing. But even after the miraculous night journey, the hardships on earth did not ease. The leaders of Quraysh, furious at the continued spread of Islam, plotted to assassinate the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. They met in secret, planning to kill him in the darkness of night, thinking that would end his mission. But Allah was watching, and he instructed his messenger to leave Mecca. And so, the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, was forced to leave his homeland, the city of his birth, the Kaaba, and the memories of his family. This was a Hijrah, the migration to Medina, not just a change of location, but a turning point in Islamic history. He left behind everything familiar, trusting in Allah alone. It was a powerful lesson for us, that sometimes leaving comfort is the only way to fulfill a higher purpose. When the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, arrived in Medina, he was welcomed with open hearts by the Ansar, the helpers. For the first time, he had a community that embraced his message. He was no longer just a preacher. He became a leader, a judge, a commander, and a nation builder. But peace was far from easy. Within Medina, there were hypocrites, those who pretended to be Muslim while secretly plotting against him. Outside Medina, the Quraysh and other Arab tribes were thirsting for war. And now, the responsibility of establishing a just society, rooted in faith and law, rested solely on his shoulders. He had to unite tribes, settle disputes, protect the city, and teach the people, all while facing threats from every side. Still, he remained patient, wise, and deeply reliant on Allah. Over the span of just 10 years in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was compelled to participate in 13 major battles, each one filled with danger, sacrifice, and deep emotional weight. From the Battle of Badr, where the outnumbered Muslims claimed a miraculous victory, to the painful losses at Uhud and the tense siege during the Battle of the Trench Kondak, each confrontation tested the strength and unity of the Muslim community. At Uhud, the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, himself was badly wounded, his tooth was broken, his cheek was cut, and blood flowed from his noble face. Yet in the midst of that suffering, he didn't call for vengeance. Instead, he raised his hands and said, "O Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know." His heart remained full of mercy, even for those who tried to kill him. Throughout his life, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, endured unimaginable personal loss. His beloved daughter Ruqayyah, may Allah be pleased with her, fell ill and died just before the Battle of Badr, a moment when joy and sorrow collided. Later, his infant son Ibrahim passed away in his arms, breathing his last at a tender age. In total, the Prophet buried 6 of his 7 children with his own hands. No parent should have to bury their child once, let alone 6 times. And yet, he remained patient, composed, and faithful. He cried, yes, but never complained against Allah's decree. His grief was real, but his trust in Allah's wisdom was even stronger. These personal tragedies made him deeply compassionate to others, especially those who suffered loss. No parent ever wishes to outlive their child. It's a pain that cuts deeper than words, a sorrow that lingers for a lifetime. And yet, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, after burying one child after another, never complained to people, never questioned Allah's decree. He would shed silent tears and turn his heart fully to Allah, pouring out his grief in du'a and submission. In his example, he taught us how to respond to loss with dignity, patience, and faith. He reminded us of the powerful words from the Quran, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To Allah we belong and to him we return. This wasn't just a phrase to him. It was a lived reality, a reminder that this world is temporary, and that every loss brings us one step closer to our true home in the hereafter. Despite being the most beloved human to Allah, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, did not live a life of luxury. In fact, his home often went without food for days. Sometimes, no fire was lit in his household, not because of neglect, but because there was nothing to cook. He and his family would survive on a few dates or a sip of water. And during the most difficult days, the Prophet, may peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, would tie stones to his stomach just to ease the intense hunger pangs. He had access to power, to wealth, to the spoils of war, but he chose simplicity, humility, and detachment from the material world. His hunger wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a powerful demonstration of contentment with Allah and the life of the hereafter over the temporary pleasures of this world. The Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, didn't sleep on silk or soft cushions. He slept on a simple straw mat, so rough that it would leave visible marks on his blessed back. One day, Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, entered his home and saw these marks etched into his skin. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he couldn't hold them back. He said, "O Messenger of Allah, the kings of Rome and Persia live in luxury and comfort, surrounded by silk and gold, while you live like this?" The Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, looked at him with calm and wisdom, and reminded him that this world is not our goal. He chose simplicity, not out of necessity, but out of devotion to Allah and a clear understanding that the Akhirah, the hereafter, is far better and everlasting. In response to Umar's tears and concern, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, offered a profound and timeless reminder. He said, "What have I to do with this world? I am like a traveler who stops to rest in the shade of a tree, then continues on his journey." With these few simple words, he taught us that this world is temporary, a brief stop, not the final destination. He wasn't attached to palaces, riches, or comfort, because his eyes were always fixed on the Akhirah, the eternal life after death. His journey was one of purpose, not luxury. He came to deliver a message, to call humanity to truth, and once his task was done, he would return to his Lord. His humility, even at the height of his influence, was a lesson for every believer to live simply and focus on the next life. The Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was not only tested by enemies, but also by those who were supposed to be allies. Some Arab tribes that had signed peace treaties with the Muslims broke their agreements, turning against him at the worst possible moments. Even in the heat of battle, some of his own companions abandoned their posts, as happened during the Battle of Uhud, leading to painful consequences. But the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, did not erupt in anger. He did not curse or humiliate them. Instead, he remained calm and responded with wisdom, mercy, and patience. He corrected mistakes gently, always prioritizing hearts and guidance over punishment. His leadership was not built on fear. It was built on trust, compassion, and an unwavering connection to Allah, no matter how many times others failed him. In the 8th year after Hijrah, 8H, after more than 2 decades of hardship, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, finally returned to Mecca, the The city that had once driven him out mocked him and tortured his followers. But he didn't return with pride or vengeance. He returned with humility and mercy, standing in front of the very people who had plotted to kill him, beaten his companions, and caused him years of suffering. He had the power to punish them all, but instead, he gathered them and said the unforgettable words, "Go, for you are free." In that moment, he showed the true power of forgiveness. There was no revenge in his heart, only light mercy and submission to Allah. This act of grace won more hearts than any sword ever could. This was the mercy of Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. A mercy not just for his companions, but for all of humanity. He didn't just preach forgiveness. He lived it, even when he had every right to seek justice. In Makkah, he had the full power to punish those who had caused him and his followers years of pain, loss, and humiliation. But instead, he chose mercy over revenge, compassion over retaliation. He showed the world that true strength lies not in crushing your enemies, but in forgiving them, in giving people a second chance. His heart remained pure, even in victory. Through his actions, he taught us that Islam is a religion of mercy, and that the strongest person is not the one who overcomes others, but the one who overcomes his own anger and forgives for the sake of Allah. In the final years of his blessed life, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, began to experience physical weakness. His body grew frail, and he was often gripped by intense fever and fatigue. Yet, even in this state, he continued to lead the Ummah, never abandoning his responsibility. Toward the end, he was so weak that he led the prayers sitting down, unable to stand. At times, he had to be supported by Ali and his uncle Abbas. May Allah be pleased with him, just to walk into the mosque. Every step was a struggle, yet he kept moving, kept guiding, kept praying. His body was failing, but his spirit remained unshaken. His commitment to the mission never faltered, right until his final breath. It was as if he was teaching us, even in weakness, never give up the worship of Allah. As the final moment of his life approached, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, lay on his deathbed, his body weak, but his heart still filled with love and concern for his Ummah. In those sacred last breaths, he didn't speak of himself. He didn't ask for comfort. Instead, his focus remained where it had always been, on his people. With a voice barely above a whisper, he said, As-Salah, the prayer, and what your right hands possess." His final words were a reminder of the trust and responsibility we all carry, to uphold the daily prayers and to treat those under our care with dignity and justice. Even as his soul was preparing to return to its Lord, his greatest concern was that the Ummah would remain connected to Allah. It was the heart of a true leader, thinking of his followers until the very end. Then, in the final moments of his noble life, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, raised his eyes toward the heavens. His soul, tired and worn from a lifetime of sacrifice, was now preparing to return to its Creator. And with serenity on his face and love in his heart, he uttered his final words, "O Allah," with the highest companionship. With those words, he chose to be with Allah, the angels, and the righteous, leaving behind this temporary world. His mission was complete. The Quran was delivered. The people were guided. The example was lived. And then, the mercy to all of creation returned to his Lord. The world lost its greatest light that day, but his legacy lives on in our hearts, in our prayers, and in every act of goodness inspired by his example. Dear viewers, the hardships of Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, were not merely stories from the past or historical events to be admired from a distance. They were divine lessons, sent by Allah to guide every believer who feels broken, burdened, or alone. When we face pain, loss, rejection, or fear, we are not walking a new path. We are walking the same path that the Prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, walked with dignity and faith. His life reminds us that hardship does not mean abandonment, and that every test carries within it a hidden mercy. If the most beloved Allah was tested so deeply, then know that your struggles are not without purpose. Hold tight to prayer. Stay firm in faith. And remember, you are never alone. Allah is with you, just as he was with his Prophet. If you've ever lost someone you love, remember that the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, buried 6 of his children with his own hands. If you've ever been betrayed, know that tribes broke their treaties with him, and even close companions faltered in critical moments. If you face poverty, hunger, or illness, remember, he tied stones to his stomach to bear the hunger, went days without food, and still remained grateful. If you've been insulted, mocked, or misunderstood, know that he endured all of it with patience. Whatever you're going through, he went through it too, and came out stronger, closer to Allah, and more radiant in faith. His life is a mirror for ours, showing us that pain isn't the end. It's part of the path to eternal success. But despite everything, the loss, the pain, the rejection, and the endless trials, the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, never gave up. Not for a moment did he turn away from Allah. His heart remained firm, his soul anchored in faith, and his footsteps steady on the path of truth. And it was because of his unshakable resilience, his unbreakable trust in Allah, that today we have Islam. We have the Quran, prayer, and the light of guidance in our lives. Every act of worship we perform today is part of the legacy he left behind. His perseverance wasn't just for his time. It was a gift for all humanity, a mercy, a light, and a path for all those who strive, struggle, and refuse to give up. So, whenever life feels overwhelming, when the burdens weigh you down and your heart begins to break, pause, take a deep breath, and say to yourself, my prophet went through more. He faced more pain, more betrayal, more hunger, more loss, and yet he smiled. He forgave those who hurt him. He prayed through his tears. He kept moving forward with grace, hope, and full trust in Allah. Let his life be your inspiration. Let his strength become your strength. Because if he, the most beloved of Allah, endured and remained patient, then you too can rise with dignity, persevere with faith, and keep your heart connected to the one who never leaves you, Allah, the most merciful. Let's honor the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, not just by loving his story, but by living his character. His legacy wasn't meant to be just admired. It was meant to be embodied. So be kind, even when people are rude. Be patient, even when your heart is hurting. Forgive when it would be easier to hate. Speak truth, even when it costs you. And in every moment, whether of joy or sorrow, place your trust fully in Allah, because that is how he lived. And when we strive to follow his example, we not only honor him, we bring light into our own lives and walk the same path to peace, purpose, and paradise. May peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad, the mercy to all of mankind. His life was not just a story. It was a living guide, filled with lessons of strength, patience, and love. If this video touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting and inspiring Islamic stories that remind us of our faith, our purpose, and our connection to Allah. And always remember, no matter what you're going through, no matter how heavy the struggle feels, Allah sees you. He hears your prayers, and your prophet, may the peace and blessing of Allah be upon him, walk this path before you, showing you that with faith, you can rise again. May Allah bless you, guide you, and fill your life with peace. Until next time, stay strong, stay faithful, and keep holding on to the rope of Allah. Jazakum Allahu khairan for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.